The air in Spain was thick with uncertainty and tension. It was the early 19th century, a time when the winds of change were blowing through Europe, pushing nations into turbulent seas of revolution, reform, and unrest. In the heart of the Iberian Peninsula, one kingdom stood at a crossroads. Spain, a monarchy that had once been a symbol of power and stability, was now plagued by division, internal strife, and the looming shadow of foreign influence. It was a kingdom whose future was uncertain, and its royal family, caught between tradition and progress, was about to face its greatest trial. The story of Isabella II, the young queen whose reign would span decades of turmoil and upheaval, began with a tragedy that would forever shape the future of Spain. In 1833, King Ferdinand VII, the monarch who had ruled Spain for much of the early 19th century, died suddenly. His death set in motion a chain of events that would see his young daughter, Isabella, ascend to the throne. But the transition was not smooth, and the death of Ferdinand was far from a peaceful end to his reign. Ferdinand's passing was met with political chaos. He had no male heir, and under Spanish law, the throne would pass to his daughter Isabella. But there was a significant problem. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, claimed the throne for himself, arguing that Isabella's right to rule was invalid due to the male preference primogeniture that had been part of Spanish succession law for centuries. Don Carlos, a man with his own vision of Spain's future, led a faction of the military and nobility who were determined to keep the throne within the male line. The stage was set for what would become one of Spain's bloodiest conflicts, the Carlist Wars. Isabella, only 3 years old at the time of her father's death, was too young to assume the throne. In her place, her mother, Maria Cristina, became regent. Maria Cristina's position was tenuous from the start, as a woman in a time when political power was overwhelmingly male. She had to navigate a court filled with intrigue and danger. Her regency was marked by a deepening divide between the forces of conservatism, led by Don Carlos, and the liberal factions who supported Isabella's ascension. The country was divided, not just in political ideals, but in its very future. The Carlist Wars erupted in the years following Ferdinand's death, a series of brutal civil wars that would rage on for much of the 19th century. On one side, the Carlists, conservatives who wanted a more traditional Spain, one that adhered to old values and resisted liberal reforms, fought for Don Carlos. On the other side, the liberals, many of whom were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution and the changes sweeping across Europe, rallied around Isabella's cause. They saw her as the symbol of progress, of a Spain that could evolve and modernize. As Isabella's mother struggled to maintain control, it became clear that this was not merely a battle for the throne, but a battle for the soul of Spain itself. Would it remain anchored in its feudal past, or would it embrace the winds of change and move towards a modern, constitutional monarchy? For Isabella, this was not just a matter of political survival, it was her birthright. A responsibility thrust upon her shoulders at a tender age. Maria Cristina was determined to see her daughter crowned as queen, and with the support of liberal factions, she fought back against the Carlist threat. The political landscape was a battlefield, with alliances shifting and the royal family caught in the middle. Isabella's supporters, including military leaders and influential politicians, worked tirelessly to secure her place on the throne, but they were constantly faced with the looming threat of Carlist forces who refused to back down. It was during these early years of her life, amidst the chaos and conflict, that Isabella would begin to understand the weight of the crown she was destined to wear. While the Carlist Wars raged on, Isabella remained in the safety of her mother's regency, shielded from the direct horrors of battle, but still acutely aware of the stakes involved. The kingdom was divided, and the future of Spain hung in the balance. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but Isabella's destiny had already been set in motion. As Isabella grew older, the influence of her mother would continue to shape her early years as queen. Maria Cristina's regency, while turbulent, would set the stage for Isabella's eventual ascension to the throne. Yet even as Isabella's supporters fought to secure her future, there were those who questioned whether the young queen would be able to rule effectively. The question was no longer just about whether Isabella could inherit the throne. It was about whether she could overcome the deep political divisions that threatened to tear Spain apart. The young queen's reign would begin with a fragile peace. But it would soon become apparent that the struggles for power within the royal court were far from over. Spain was on the brink of a new chapter in its history. But it was unclear whether the kingdom could survive the forces that were pulling it in different directions. For Isabella II, the road ahead would be anything but easy. The legacy of a kingdom that had once seemed so secure was now in question. And only time would tell if Isabella could rise to the challenge of leading Spain through its most difficult period. The events of 1833, with the death of Ferdinand VII and the ascension of Isabella II, set the stage for a reign that would span decades, filled with conflict, intrigue, and transformation. But at that moment, in the early days of her reign, Spain was a kingdom teetering on the edge of history, its future uncertain, its people divided, and its monarch a young girl who would have to grow up quickly if she were to rule. The stage was set for the turbulent journey that lay ahead, and Isabella's story was only just beginning. The young Isabella II was a child caught in the swirling chaos of her country's future. A country torn apart by civil war, political turmoil, and the fierce struggles for control. Though she was only 3 years old when her father, King Ferdinand VII, passed away, her presence on the throne signaled the start of a profound transformation that would eventually reshape Spain forever. Isabella's early years were marked not by innocence and peace, but by uncertainty and danger, as factions within Spain fought for supremacy over the monarchy. For Isabella, her childhood would be far from ordinary. While most children her age were sheltered from the weight of governance, Isabella was thrust into a political world where the stakes were high, and the consequences of failure could be catastrophic. Her mother, Maria Cristina, became the regent for Isabella in 1833, stepping into a role that no woman had ever held before in Spain's history. Maria Cristina's power, though, was fragile, built on shaky alliances with the liberal factions that supported her daughter's claim to the throne. The regency was a period of deep political unrest. The country was divided into two factions: the liberals, who championed Isabella as the rightful queen and supported constitutional reforms, and the Carlists, who believed Isabella's uncle, Don Carlos, should rule instead. The Carlists rejected the succession law that gave the throne to Isabella, arguing that it violated the traditional principles of male preference primogeniture. This division led to the outbreak of the First Carlist War, 1833 to 1839. A brutal civil conflict that raged across Spain and deeply affected Isabella's early life. Although Isabella was far too young to understand the full scope of the conflict, her mother's regency was defined by the need to maintain control in a country on the brink of civil war. For Maria Cristina, every decision she made was under intense scrutiny, and she faced constant challenges from both the Carlists and conservative factions within the Spanish court. The Carlist forces, led by Don Carlos, were entrenched in many parts of Spain, and their challenge to Isabella's ascension to the throne could not be easily dismissed. The Carlists were not just military opponents, they were also ideologically opposed to the liberal reforms that Isabella's supporters sought to implement. For them, Isabella's very existence on the throne was an affront to Spain's traditional order. In contrast, Maria Cristina's liberal allies saw her as a symbol of progress and modernity, though they too were fragmented and divided in their vision of Spain's future. The monarchy itself was caught between two competing visions for the nation's soul. As the Carlist forces clashed with Isabella's liberal supporters, the young queen's childhood became defined by the shadow of war. Isabella was not yet old enough to take part in any military actions or political discussions, but her presence at the center of the conflict was undeniable. Every military victory and defeat, every political maneuver by her mother and her allies, was ultimately tied to the fate of the young girl who had been placed at the center of this war for the throne. Despite the conflict, Isabella's early years were also marked by moments of joy. In the safety of the royal court, surrounded by trusted allies, she enjoyed the company of her family, her governesses, and her tutors. Her mother, Maria Cristina, was deeply devoted to her, and Isabella's upbringing was structured with care. Even if the political stakes loomed large in the background, she was taught the arts of diplomacy, governance, and leadership, although she was far too young to fully comprehend the significance of the lessons she was receiving. Isabella's education, however, would prove essential in the years to come. for it was not long before she would be thrust into the role of monarch. In the midst of the chaos, Isabella's early years were also defined by the presence of key figures who would influence her destiny. One of the most prominent was her mother's regent, Maria Cristina. Though she was a woman in a world dominated by men, Maria Cristina was determined to protect her daughter's claim to the throne. She navigated the intricacies of royal politics and maneuvered within the shifting alliances of the court. Her political skill would help her maintain power, but she was constantly challenged by rivals who questioned her authority. The court was full of intrigue, and Maria Cristina's enemies were ever present, waiting for the moment when they could strike and weaken her hold over the monarchy. As the Carlist War continued to rage, Maria Cristina had to make strategic decisions to protect Isabella and ensure her reign. By 1839, the war finally came to an end, with the liberal forces emerging victorious. However, the victory did not bring an immediate peace. The country remained deeply divided, and Isabella's position on the throne was still fragile. Her legitimacy was constantly questioned by those who viewed her reign as the result of political compromise, not divine right. While Maria Cristina's regency was officially over, the young Isabella was not yet able to take the reins of power on her own. Her rule would continue to be shaped by the volatile political landscape of Spain, a country still healing from the wounds of civil war and political division. Despite the challenges she faced, Isabella's early experiences shaped her character. She was exposed to the harsh realities of political life at a young age. And though she may not have fully understood the complexity of the conflicts unfolding around her, she grew to be a resilient and determined monarch. Her mother's influence and the lessons she learned during this turbulent period would be crucial as she prepared to step into her role as queen. The Carlist Wars may have ended, but the struggle for control of the monarchy was far from over. Isabella would have to navigate the intricate web of Spanish politics, balancing the competing demands of her allies, her enemies, and the nation she was destined to rule. Her early years, filled with political intrigue and conflict, would be just the beginning of a reign that would span decades. Marked by triumphs and tragedies, moments of glory and deep disappointment. In the years that followed, Isabella would emerge from the shadows of her early childhood and begin to play a more active role in her kingdom's affairs. But the lessons of her early years, shaped by war, political strife, and the influence of those around her, would remain with her as she faced the challenges of leadership. The young queen had survived the tumult of her early years, and now she was ready to take the next step into the stormy world of Spanish politics. As Isabella II entered her teenage years, the political landscape of Spain remained unsettled, and her regency was far from peaceful. Maria Cristina, the mother of the young queen, had played a pivotal role in securing Isabella's place on the throne during the First Carlist War. But her power was fragile. Maria Cristina's influence was repeatedly challenged by various factions, each with their own vision for Spain's future. Yet despite the turbulent nature of her regency, Maria Cristina's leadership would leave an indelible mark on both her daughter and the monarchy itself. In 1839, the Carlist forces were decisively defeated, marking the end of the First Carlist War. The resolution of this conflict was a significant milestone for the Spanish monarchy, as it solidified Isabella's right to rule in the eyes of the liberal faction, who had backed her claim since her father's death. However, the end of the war did not bring an end to the internal power struggles that plagued Spain. While the Carlists had been defeated on the battlefield, the underlying tensions between conservatives and liberals continued to fester within the court and government. Maria Cristina, though relieved from her regency in 1840, did not fade from the scene. Her influence continued to shape Isabella's reign, and the mother-daughter bond proved to be a source of strength. Maria Cristina remained Isabella's advisor and confidant, helping her navigate the complexities of court life. For Isabella, this relationship was crucial, as she had been thrust into a political world where the demands of monarchy and the realities of governance often collided with personal desires. Maria Cristina's leadership had been marked by several key political decisions, particularly her alliance with liberal factions. The liberals in Spain, seeking to modernize the country and adopt a constitutional monarchy, had been her strongest supporters. In contrast, Isabella's father, King Ferdinand VII, had been deeply conservative, resisting any kind of political reform. After his death, Maria Cristina embraced the liberal reforms that were becoming increasingly popular in Spain. And she worked to ensure that Isabella's reign would be aligned with these principles. Under Maria Cristina's guidance, Spain began a gradual shift toward liberalism. The country moved towards constitutionalism, with the establishment of a more formalized system of government that included the creation of the Spanish Constitution of 1837. This constitution aimed to limit the power of the monarchy and provide more political representation through a parliamentary system. It was an ambitious plan to modernize Spain, and while it was not without its flaws, it represented a significant departure from the absolutist rule of the previous generations. For Isabella, the constitutional changes marked a new era of monarchy, one in which she would eventually have to play a central role. Despite Maria Cristina's efforts to push for liberal reforms, her reign was marred by constant political turmoil. Her alliances were fragile, and there were always factions within Spain that sought to undo the reforms she championed. The conservatives, who had supported Don Carlos during the Carlist War, remained a powerful force in the country. Their resistance to the changes made by the liberals ensured that Isabella's reign would not be one of political peace. The influence of the conservatives within the court would come to a head later in Isabella's reign, as she found herself forced to make difficult decisions to maintain her power. At the same time, Isabella's relationship with her mother was not solely based on politics. Maria Cristina was a devoted mother who sought to protect her daughter from the pressures of the throne. She took an active role in Isabella's education, carefully selecting her tutors and ensuring that the young queen was well versed in the history, culture, and politics of Spain. Isabella was groomed to be not only a monarch but also a figurehead of liberal progress, someone who would usher in a new era for the country. Yet, while Maria Cristina's guidance was essential to Isabella's early development, it also set a precedent for the young queen's reliance on others to help her navigate the complex world of governance. The bond between mother and daughter remained strong, even as political realities pulled them in different directions. By the time Isabella reached her teenage years, it was clear that she was no longer a passive figurehead in the monarchy. She was becoming more involved in the political life of the kingdom, and her mother's influence was key in preparing her for the challenges ahead. But Maria Cristina's influence would soon face its own limitations, as she had to contend with growing dissatisfaction among the Spanish people and increasing pressure from both conservative and liberal factions within the court. One of the defining moments of Maria Cristina's regency came when she made the decision to marry Isabella off to Francisco de Asís, her cousin and a member of the Spanish royal family. This marriage was not born out of romantic love, but rather out of political necessity. Maria Cristina saw it as a way to consolidate Isabella's position on the throne and secure her reign in a time of political instability. The marriage was meant to unite the Spanish monarchy with other European royal houses and reinforce the legitimacy of Isabella's rule. But the match proved to be more complicated than Maria Cristina had anticipated. Francisco de Asís, while from a royal family, was far from a suitable partner for Isabella in terms of political or personal compatibility. He was passive, uninterested in ruling, and his marriage to Isabella was marked by an emotional distance that would persist throughout their union. Isabella's personal unhappiness with the marriage, along with her increasing awareness of the limitations placed upon her as a monarch, added complexity to her relationship with her mother. While Maria Cristina's political acumen was undeniable, her daughter's frustration with the marriage and the pressures of rule would become a source of tension between them in the years to come. By the time Maria Cristina was officially removed as regent in 1840, Isabella was growing into her role as queen. But the country was far from stable. The political landscape was continually shifting, and Isabella's reign would soon be tested by forces beyond her mother's control. The shadow of the Carlists still lingered, and the political divisions between conservatives and liberals were growing ever more pronounced. The young queen would need to find her own way forward, drawing on the lessons her mother had taught her while also confronting the challenges of ruling a divided and struggling kingdom. In the years following Maria Cristina's departure from the regency, Isabella would find herself more deeply involved in the decisions of state. No longer a mere figurehead, she was now expected to lead Spain through an increasingly turbulent time. But the influence of her mother, both politically and emotionally, would continue to shape her reign, even as Isabella sought to establish her own authority and navigate the complex dynamics of court and government. The lessons of Maria Christina's regency would remain with Isabella, but the young queen's reign was only just beginning, and the challenges she would face would only grow more daunting as time went on. As Isabella II entered her teenage years, the weight of the Spanish crown began to feel heavier upon her young shoulders. Despite the trials of her early childhood and the guiding hand of her mother, Maria Christina, the time was rapidly approaching when the young queen would be expected to take on the full responsibilities of her monarchy. While her childhood had been marked by the instability of the Carlist Wars and the constant political strife, the moment was fast approaching when she would have to step out from the shadows and face the challenges of ruling a divided nation. By the year 1843, Isabella was just 13 years old, still a child in many ways, yet already thrust into the whirlwind of courtly politics. With Maria Christina's regency officially coming to an end, Isabella was formally declared of age to govern, an event that would mark the beginning of her reign in earnest. The young queen was now expected to assume the powers of the throne. Although in reality, the political landscape was far from settled. The liberals, who had long supported Isabella's ascension, had won the battle for her legitimacy, but the country remained deeply divided between conservative and progressive forces. To solidify her position, Isabella had to navigate a treacherous political landscape, making alliances and managing enemies, all while growing into the role of monarch. One of the most significant decisions of Isabella's early reign was her marriage to Francisco de Assis, her cousin and a member of the Spanish royal family. The marriage was not born of love or romantic desire, but rather political necessity. Maria Christina, ever mindful of her daughter's security, sought to unite Isabella's rule with that of another branch of the royal family. Francisco de Assis was a royal figure, and their union was meant to strengthen Isabella's position in a kingdom that had long been fragmented by political struggles. However, the match proved to be less than ideal. Francisco de Assis, though from an esteemed family, was far from a suitable partner for Isabella in terms of political partnership. He was known to be a passive and withdrawn man, more interested in personal leisure than the affairs of state. Their marriage was arranged, not out of mutual affection but out of a sense of obligation and political strategy. The union was meant to provide stability to Isabella's reign, but it quickly became clear that it would fail to provide her with the emotional and political support she so desperately needed. For Isabella, the marriage to Francisco de Assis became one of the first of many frustrations she would face during her reign. While she was a strong-willed and determined young woman, her marriage to Francisco placed a significant strain on her emotional life. The lack of affection and the growing emotional distance between the couple would become a constant source of tension in Isabella's life. As she faced the difficulties of ruling a kingdom in the midst of a political storm. Despite the challenges of her personal life, Isabella's ascension to power was marked by her early attempts at consolidating her authority. In the years following her marriage, Isabella worked to assert her position as queen, seeking to balance the competing factions within her court. The liberals, who had long supported her, pushed for progressive reforms and sought to modernize Spain, while the conservatives, who had supported the Carlists in the previous war, remained a powerful force in the country. The tensions between these factions were a constant threat to Isabella's rule, and she found herself navigating a delicate political dance to maintain her grip on power. During the early years of her reign, Isabella relied heavily on advisors and ministers to guide her decisions. One of the most prominent figures during this period was the military leader and statesman, Ramón María Narváez. Narváez, a conservative general who had fought in the Carlist Wars, played a key role in shaping Isabella's early reign. Though he was a staunch conservative, he was also a pragmatic leader who recognized the importance of maintaining stability in the kingdom. Narváez became a trusted advisor to Isabella, and his influence would be crucial in the early years of her reign. His conservative leanings, however, would later create friction with Isabella as she sought to embrace the progressive ideals that had shaped her early education. Another key figure in Isabella's early reign was the liberal leader, Baldomero Espartero. Espartero, a hero of the First Carlist War and a champion of liberal reforms. played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of Spain during Isabella's youth. His support for Isabella was instrumental in her early rise to power, and his influence on her was evident in her attempts to navigate the challenges of ruling a divided Spain. However, as Isabella grew older and her reign progressed, Espartero's influence waned, and he eventually became a political rival. The tensions between the liberal and conservative factions within the court only deepened, and Isabella found herself increasingly caught between the two. As Isabella's reign progressed, her personal frustrations began to intertwine with the larger political challenges facing Spain. While the young queen had inherited the throne during a time of significant upheaval, she was also a symbol of hope for those who believed in the possibility of a more modern, constitutional monarchy. The liberal faction saw her as the embodiment of progress, while the conservatives viewed her as a pawn in the larger struggle for control of Spain's political future. Isabella's struggle to assert her authority, while also grappling with the challenges of her personal life, would define the early years of her reign. In the midst of these political and personal challenges, Isabella's reign took on a deeper significance. Her ascension to power marked the beginning of a new chapter in Spain's history, one that would be defined by a constant struggle between progress and tradition, between reform and conservatism. As the young queen faced the challenges of ruling a divided kingdom, she would be forced to confront the complex dynamics of her court, her marriage, and her nation. Isabella's early years as queen were marked by a series of political struggles, both within the royal court and throughout Spain. The tensions between liberals and conservatives would continue to shape the course of her reign, and her marriage to Francisco de Asís would become a source of personal disappointment. But despite the challenges she faced, Isabella remained determined to fulfill her role as queen and to navigate the complex world of Spanish politics. Her ascension to power, though fraught with difficulty, was only the beginning of a reign that would span decades, filled with triumphs, tragedies, and the constant struggle to define her legacy. The young queen's journey was just beginning, and as she moved forward, she would face the difficult decisions that would shape the future of Spain. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but Isabella II's story was one of perseverance, political struggle, and the quest for stability in a kingdom on the brink of change. The years following Isabella II's formal ascension to the throne in 1843 were both promising and tumultuous. Now a young queen at the age of 13, Isabella was stepping into a world of political intrigue, war, and the expectations of a nation eager for stability. Her mother, Maria Cristina, had done all she could to guide Isabella through the complexities of governance. But the time had come for the young monarch to stand on her own 2 feet. However, the Spanish throne was not one of peace, nor of simple triumph. It was a seat marred by conflict, discord, and the weight of political forces, each one pulling in different directions. Isabella's early reign was defined by the necessity of asserting her authority in a country that was deeply divided. Although she had the support of the liberals, who saw her as a beacon of hope for constitutional reform, the Carlists, who were still loyal to the claim of Don Carlos, continued to disrupt Spain's fragile peace. In addition to the lingering scars of the Carlist Wars, the country was plagued by frequent political instability, a lack of unity, and the influence of foreign powers in Spain's internal affairs. It was a period in which the monarchy's legitimacy was continually questioned, and Isabella found herself facing political battles on multiple fronts. Isabella's first significant challenge as monarch came almost immediately after her ascension to power. The country's political factions, liberals, conservatives, and Carlists, vied for influence, and her position was far from secure. While the Carlists had been defeated in the war, the ideological divide between the factions was still very much alive. The conservatives were resistant to the liberal reforms that had been set in motion by Maria Cristina, and they began to grow increasingly discontent with Isabella's association with the liberals. This division led to a period of instability that would shape much of Isabella's early reign. Though she was queen, Isabella was still very much a young woman, and much of the responsibility for governing was left to her ministers and advisors. These ministers, many of whom had been appointed by her mother, were often at odds with one another, creating a fractured government that struggled to find common ground. Even as the queen sought to assert herself, The political power struggles within the court and the wider country meant that she was often a figurehead rather than an active participant in governance. The tension between the need to assert her authority as queen and the reality of political factions constantly vying for power would be a persistent theme throughout her reign. One of the early, crucial figures in Isabella's reign was the conservative general, Ramon Maria Narvaez. Narvaez was a powerful leader who had played a key role in suppressing the Carlist forces during the war. And he was a staunch supporter of the monarchy. However, his conservatism was at odds with Isabella's liberal leanings, and their relationship was often strained. Narvaez was one of the few men who commanded Isabella's respect, and he was instrumental in securing her position after her ascension to the throne. Despite their political differences, Narvaez understood the importance of maintaining stability and sought to guide Isabella through the turbulent waters of Spanish politics. Narvaez's influence, however, would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for Isabella. His conservative views clashed with the liberal reforms that had defined her early years. And as tensions mounted, Isabella was forced to navigate these competing ideologies. She was caught between the demands of the conservatives, who sought to preserve Spain's traditional power structures, and the liberals, who pushed for reforms that would transform the nation into a more modern constitutional monarchy. In the midst of this political tension, Isabella faced personal challenges as well. Her marriage to Francisco de Assis, while politically advantageous, was marked by emotional distance. The young queen had hoped for a partner with whom she could share the burdens of rule. But Francisco was not the companion she had envisioned. His indifference to the responsibilities of the monarchy, coupled with his lack of political engagement, left Isabella feeling isolated in her role as queen. The marriage was a source of personal disappointment, and Isabella began to realize that she would have to rely more on her advisors and allies to navigate the political landscape of Spain. Despite the difficulties of her personal life, Isabella's reign continued to be marked by her determination to assert her authority. Her education, largely shaped by the political turbulence of her early years, had taught her the importance of political maneuvering, the necessity of strategic alliances, and the harsh realities of power. As she matured, Isabella became more confident in her role as monarch, though she was still often seen as a symbol of the broader ideological struggle between the competing forces of Spain. Isabella's relationship with her ministers remained complex. While some, like Narvaez, were instrumental in keeping her in power, others were less sympathetic to her reign. One such figure was Baldomero Espartero, the liberal general who had been a hero in the First Carlist War. Espartero was a man of great ambition and a champion of liberal reforms. But his relationship with Isabella soured over time, as he sought greater control over the government. His conflicts with Isabella became increasingly public. Espartero's push for a more radical liberal agenda, combined with his personal rivalry with Narvaez, made for a volatile political environment. In 1847, tensions between Espartero and Isabella reached a boiling point, and Espartero resigned from his position as regent. His resignation marked a significant shift in Isabella's reign, as it left the young queen to confront her political enemies without the guidance of one of her most powerful allies. The departure of Espartero was a blow to the liberal cause, and it led to a period of conservative dominance in the Spanish government. Isabella, though still young and inexperienced, had to navigate the ever-shifting allegiances within her court and decide where her true loyalties lay. The years that followed Espartero's resignation were marked by growing instability. Isabella's inability to fully assert her power, combined with the political infighting that plagued her court, meant that her reign was characterized by inconsistency and tension. The liberal reforms that had defined the early years of her reign were slowly undone by conservative forces. And Isabella found herself increasingly isolated. Her desire to rule with independence was constantly thwarted by the powerful men around her. And her inability to reconcile the competing ideologies within her court left her struggling to maintain control. The struggles of these early years set the stage for the dramatic changes that would come later in Isabella's reign. While her efforts to assert her power and govern effectively were often stymied, she was learning the complexities of rule and the importance of political alliances. As her reign continued, Isabella would face even greater challenges, including the rise of more radical liberal movements, the continued resistance of conservative factions, and the increasing political instability that would ultimately lead to the Glorious Revolution of 1868. But for now, the young queen was still learning to navigate the labyrinth of Spanish politics, a task that was far more difficult than she had ever imagined. By the late 1850s, Isabella II's reign had become a battleground for two conflicting forces: the conservatives who sought to preserve Spain's traditional systems of power, and the liberals who desired a more progressive, modernized monarchy. While Isabella had spent much of her early years as queen trying to balance these competing factions, the pressure to choose a side became increasingly inevitable as Spain entered a new phase of its political development. The liberals, now emboldened by recent events, began to push harder for reforms that would fundamentally change the structure of the Spanish state, leading to a period of liberal governance marked by bold decisions, internal conflict, and a search for a new path forward. The late 1850s saw the growing influence of figures such as Leopoldo O'Donnell and Ramon Maria Narváez, whose liberal views had begun to eclipse the more conservative elements that had previously dominated Isabella's court. The rising power of these progressives led to a shift in the political dynamics of Spain. And soon, the monarchy would find itself in the midst of the political and social transformations sweeping through Europe at the time. For Isabella, this period marked a time of great change, both personally and politically. The progressives had been steadily gaining ground in the political arena. Their ideas, spurred by the winds of change in Europe, embraced the ideas of the French Revolution, constitutionalism, and the push for reforms that would modernize Spain's institutions. Under the guidance of these leaders, the Spanish government began to take steps toward a more liberal system, one that would bring about constitutional changes and greater representation for the Spanish people. These ideas were seen by some as revolutionary, but to others, they were a necessary progression for a kingdom that had been stuck in the past for far too long. One of the first steps taken by the liberal faction was the attempt to amend the Spanish Constitution of 1837, a document that had already been altered several times but still lacked key reforms that would fully open the door to a modern parliamentary system. In 1856, with the increasing influence of liberal leaders, the new government began to push for a more comprehensive revision. The reforms proposed included the expansion of civil liberties, a commitment to secularism, and further curtailment of the monarchy's powers, seeking to replace it with a system that was more reflective of democratic ideals. This movement became known as the Progressive Era, a time when Spain would attempt to adapt to the evolving political landscape of Europe and beyond. For Isabella, the rise of the progressives marked a turning point in her reign. The early years of her monarchy had been dominated by political intrigue and the constant tug-of-war between liberals and conservatives. However, the increasing push for reform, coupled with her own growing sense of independence, made it clear that Isabella could no longer sit on the sidelines as passive observer. Her involvement in this new period of reform would come with significant personal and political risks. As a monarch, Isabella had to decide whether she would side with the progressives, who were calling for a radical reorganization of Spain's political structure, or with the conservatives, who championed Spain's traditional hierarchical order. The progressive movement's bold demands were not merely about political reform but about shifting the balance of power in Spain, particularly with regard to the monarchy's authority. To fully embrace liberal reforms would mean weakening the monarchy's grip on Spain's future. And Isabella was forced to confront her own beliefs and ambitions about her rule. In these years, the battle between liberals and conservatives was not just a political struggle, it was a battle for the very soul of Spain. And for Isabella, it became a fight for control over her own reign. The decision to embrace reform or resist it was more than a political one. It was a matter of her legacy and the future of her country. Yet, as the monarch, Isabella had the power to shape the outcome. The question remained: would she steer Spain toward the modernizing path of the liberals? Or would she resist their advances and maintain the status quo? It was not an easy decision. Isabella had spent much of her early reign leaning on advisors and following their counsel. But the increasingly assertive liberal factions left her with few choices. She could not remain neutral for much longer. The pressure from progressive leaders to modernize the monarchy, coupled with the mounting frustrations of Spain's impoverished masses, forced Isabella to make some difficult decisions. Her early efforts to bring about political reform came in the form of alliances with prominent liberal leaders, including O'Donnell and Espartero. These men, who had served as military leaders and champions of the liberal cause, were increasingly seen as key figures in the push for change. However, Isabella's ability to maintain these alliances was often tested by political infighting, resistance from the conservative factions, and the unpredictable nature of Spain's military leadership. The relationship between the monarch and her political allies became strained, as O'Donnell, Espartero, and others began to demand more power in exchange for their support. Isabella's struggle with these men mirrored her larger struggle with her own identity as queen. Was she to be a passive monarch, reliant on others to shape her country's destiny? Or was she to assert her own vision of Spain's future? These questions plagued Isabella, as the weight of her reign grew heavier with each passing year. Despite her attempts to embrace liberal reforms and modernize the monarchy, Isabella found herself ensnared in the complex web of court politics, military factions, and social unrest. Throughout this period, the rise of progressive movements within Spain reflected the broader European trend toward reform and constitutional monarchy. In neighboring France, England, and other parts of Europe, monarchies were undergoing significant transformations, gradually yielding to the pressures of democracy and liberal ideals. Spain, however, remained entrenched in its own history of absolutism and traditional power structures. For Isabella, embracing this new political era would mean going against centuries of established norms. It was a moment of great uncertainty for Spain. The country's economic problems, coupled with the growing influence of progressive movements, had created a volatile mix that threatened to explode at any moment. Though Isabella had inherited a country that was deeply divided, she was now tasked with bringing it into the modern age, a daunting challenge for any monarch, let alone one who had spent much of her life struggling to maintain her authority. But Isabella, despite her early frustrations, was determined not to surrender to the chaos around her. She knew that Spain's future depended on her ability to navigate the growing divide between liberals and conservatives, and her willingness to engage with reform-minded leaders would play a critical role in shaping the monarchy's future. Whether she would emerge as the true architect of Spain's political transformation or simply a bystander to the shifting tides of history was yet to be seen. As the progressives gained ground, Isabella faced the increasingly difficult task of balancing the needs of the people with the demands of the political elite. The country's economic struggles, marked by poverty, high unemployment, and a struggling agrarian sector, compounded the growing unrest among the population. Yet, despite the mounting pressure for change, the monarchy was slow to respond, and Isabella found herself trapped in a cycle of promises without significant results. The progressive era that would follow was one filled with hope and frustration. It was a time when the forces of change clashed with the forces of tradition. And Isabella, as queen, would have to make decisions that would define the course of Spanish history for years to come. The rise of the progressives and their call for liberal reforms marked a turning point in Isabella's reign. How she responded to these calls, and whether she could balance the needs of the monarchy with the demands of modernity, would determine not only her legacy but the fate of Spain itself. By the mid-1860s, the reign of Isabella II was becoming synonymous with scandal, political manipulation, and widespread corruption. The dreams of a constitutional monarchy had begun to unravel, and with each passing year, the Spanish monarchy became further entangled in the web of political and economic instability. The once promising liberal reforms, which had initially been championed as the key to Spain's modernization, had failed to live up to their promises, and the progressive leaders who had once been seen as agents of change had become part of the very system they had hoped to dismantle. During this period, Spain was plagued by a government that was unable to solve the country's many problems: political infighting, economic downturns, and a society growing increasingly disillusioned with the monarchy. It was a time when the Spanish public's faith in their monarch was eroding. And Isabella, once seen as a symbol of hope for progress, now found herself unable to stem the tide of corruption and mismanagement that defined her reign. The political climate of Spain had grown toxic, with a series of backroom deals, bribes, and shady alliances shaping the course of the nation's governance. The corruption that flourished within Isabella's court was not limited to the higher echelons of power. It seeped down to the lower levels of government, where nepotism, favoritism, and bribery ran rampant. Ministers and advisors, many of whom had been placed in positions of power through political patronage rather than merit, became increasingly focused on their own enrichment rather than the good of the country. The result was a government that, rather than serving the people, served only the interests of those at the top. One of the most significant contributors to this atmosphere of corruption was the influence of the military. Since the early years of Isabella's reign, Spain's military had played a central role in shaping the country's political landscape. Military leaders, who had once been instrumental in defending Isabella's throne during the Carlist Wars, had gradually become key political figures, wielding disproportionate influence over the country's direction. The military, as a result, became a faction unto itself, constantly pushing for more power and engaging in political intrigue that further destabilized the country. The growing influence of military leaders also created tensions within the government. The liberal reforms of the 1850s and 1860s, which sought to limit the power of the military and create a more democratic system, clashed with the entrenched interests of the military elite. As the military grew more politicized, it became clear that Isabella's ability to govern was increasingly constrained by the very forces that had once been her strongest supporters. These tensions led to a situation where the Queen was forced to make difficult decisions, often choosing between maintaining the loyalty of the military or addressing the growing unrest among the public, who were demanding more accountability from their government. Amidst the political turmoil, Isabella's personal life continued to be a source of scandal. Her marriage to Francisco de Assis, which had been an arrangement made for political stability, was now viewed by many as a symbol of the dysfunction and stagnation that characterized her reign. Francisco's indifference to his duties as consort had long been a point of contention. But as the years went by, the marriage became increasingly irrelevant to the broader issues facing the monarchy. Isabella, isolated in her palace, struggled to find a way to navigate the web of political corruption and infighting that now defined her government. The public, once hopeful for the future of Spain under the rule of a young and seemingly progressive queen, grew increasingly disillusioned with Isabella and her court. The growing sense of mistrust in the monarchy was compounded by economic difficulties. Spain's economy was stagnating, and the widespread poverty that had been a hallmark of Isabella's reign continued to worsen. The country's industrialization had stalled, and the agricultural sector remained in crisis. As a result, a large portion of the Spanish population felt abandoned by their rulers, and they began to turn their anger and frustration toward the monarchy. One of the most notable examples of the growing frustration with the monarchy was the increasing number of uprisings and protests that took place throughout Spain during this period. Labor strikes, demonstrations, and riots became more common, and the royal family's inability to address the country's deep-seated problems led many to question whether the monarchy could survive at all. Political unrest reached a boiling point, with widespread protests demanding not only social and economic reform but also an end to the monarchy itself. Despite the mounting public outcry, Isabella remained largely detached from the day-to-day struggles of her people. She continued to rely on her ministers and advisors, many of whom were involved in the very corruption that had come to define her reign. This detachment created an increasing sense of alienation between the monarchy and the Spanish people, who felt that their voices were being ignored. As Isabella's authority weakened, the legitimacy of the monarchy itself began to erode. The political intrigue that defined this period of Isabella's reign was not limited to the court in Madrid. Across Spain, regional tensions flared as local leaders and military figures jockeyed for power. The decentralization of authority, combined with the failure of the central government to respond effectively to regional needs, led to a fractured and unstable political environment. The country was torn between competing factions: liberals, conservatives, military leaders, and regional separatists, each of whom had their own vision for Spain's future. As political divisions deepened, Isabella found herself in the difficult position of trying to maintain control while appeasing the growing number of factions that were pulling the country in different directions. The corruption within her court only exacerbated the problem. as rival factions within her inner circle competed for power and resources. Isabella's inability to reign in this political chaos led many to question her competence as a monarch. The scandal and corruption that had come to define her reign made it increasingly difficult for Isabella to retain the support of her people and her government. As the years wore on, Isabella became more isolated. Her reliance on a small group of advisors and her increasing detachment from the everyday struggles of her country made her appear out of touch with the reality of life in Spain. The increasing unrest and the political corruption within her court created a toxic atmosphere that further alienated Isabella from her subjects. The once promising reign of Isabella II had become one of instability, scandal, and corruption, and the hope that had surrounded her early years on the throne now seemed like a distant memory. As political instability and economic decline continued to plague Spain, it became clear that a reckoning was coming. The monarchy's grip on power was weakening, and the forces of change were growing stronger. The dissatisfaction with Isabella's rule would eventually culminate in the Glorious Revolution of 1868, a movement that would forever alter the course of Spanish history and bring an end to her reign. But before that moment arrived, the political intrigue, corruption, and unrest that defined the years leading up to the revolution would continue to shape the course of Isabella's rule and the future of Spain. By the 1860s, the reign of Isabella II had entered a period of deepening crisis. What had once seemed to be a promising monarchy, rising from the turmoil of the Carlist Wars and establishing a constitutional government, was now mired in corruption, political deadlock, and a growing sense of disillusionment. The optimism of the early years of Isabella's reign had given way to frustration, and the hopes for a constitutional monarchy that would modernize Spain were gradually replaced by despair. Isabella's reign had been marked by a constant struggle between progressive reforms and conservative resistance. And by the time the late 1860s arrived, it was clear that the country was in desperate need of change. The growing discontent in Spain was not just confined to the political elite or the military. It was felt in the streets and homes of ordinary Spaniards, where poverty, social inequality, and economic stagnation had created a breeding ground for unrest. The promised reforms had largely failed to materialize, and the monarchy, seen as increasingly out of touch with the realities of life in Spain, became the target of widespread criticism. The political establishment, which had once supported Isabella's rule, was now fractured, and the public's faith in her leadership had begun to crumble. At the heart of this growing discontent was the economic crisis that had gripped Spain for much of Isabella's reign. The country was struggling with a stagnant economy, rising debt, and widespread poverty. While parts of Europe had begun to industrialize and modernize, Spain remained largely agrarian, and the economic disparities between the wealthy elites and the impoverished masses were stark. The Industrial Revolution, which had transformed much of Europe, had largely bypassed Spain, and the country remained mired in outdated agricultural practices that kept the majority of its population in poverty. The economic hardships faced by the Spanish people were exacerbated by a series of military defeats, diplomatic failures, and the constant political instability that plagued the country. The government was incapable of addressing the growing economic crisis, and as a result, social unrest grew. Strikes, protests, and riots became more frequent as workers, peasants, and the urban poor voiced their frustrations. The political elite, distracted by their own infighting and corruption, failed to respond to these grievances, further deepening the divide between the monarchy and the people. Meanwhile, the royal court, once a symbol of stability, had become synonymous with scandal and intrigue. Isabella's personal life, marked by her distant marriage to Francisco de Assis, continued to be a source of public fascination and derision. The royal family, isolated from the realities of everyday life, was seen as disconnected from the struggles of ordinary Spaniards. Isabella's failure to distance herself from the corruption that had plagued her court further undermined her credibility. The once hopeful vision of a young queen leading Spain toward progress and modernization had been replaced by an image of a monarch unable to control the forces of discontent that were sweeping through her country. The public's disillusionment with Isabella and the monarchy reached its peak in 1866, when a series of uprisings and protests erupted across the country. The unrest was not limited to the major cities, even rural areas, where agricultural workers had long been oppressed by feudal systems, saw widespread demonstrations. The uprisings were a clear sign that the people of Spain had lost confidence in their queen and the government that she headed. The cries for reform grew louder, and the demand for political change became impossible to ignore. In response to the growing unrest, Isabella attempted to make concessions, but her efforts were perceived as too little. Too late, she called for new elections and promised reforms. But these gestures failed to address the underlying problems of corruption, economic stagnation, and social inequality. The political factions within her government, already divided by years of infighting, were unable to work together to craft meaningful solutions. Isabella's inability to unite her own government and respond effectively to the cries of her people left her increasingly isolated. At the same time, the military, which had long played a powerful role in Spanish politics, became a growing force of opposition. Many military leaders, disillusioned with Isabella's rule and the failure of the monarchy to resolve the country's problems, began to plot against her. In 1866, a group of military officers led by General Juan Prim, a prominent liberal figure, staged a failed coup attempt, known as the Prim Uprising. Although the coup was quickly crushed, it served as a stark reminder of the deep divisions within the country and the growing dissatisfaction with the monarchy. The failure of the coup only fueled the growing sense of discontent. And by 1868, the political situation in Spain had reached a boiling point. A series of protests and strikes swept through the country, and the military, led by figures like General Prim, became increasingly vocal in their opposition to Isabella. It was clear that the monarchy, once seen as the central institution of Spanish life, was no longer able to command the loyalty of the people or the military. The winds of change were blowing through Spain, and it was only a matter of time before the monarchy would be forced to confront the revolution that was coming. The unrest in Spain was not just the result of economic or political failures, it was also a reflection of a larger, more profound shift in Spanish society. As the 19th century progressed, the old feudal structures that had once dominated Spanish life were breaking down. A growing middle class, buoyed by industrialization and urbanization in parts of Europe, was emerging as a powerful political force. This new class, which had begun to demand greater political representation, found itself at odds with the old aristocratic elite, who had long enjoyed the privileges of power. The growing discontent was also fueled by the changing role of the monarchy in European politics. As other European nations began to embrace constitutional monarchies and democratic reforms, Spain remained mired in the old ways of governance. The monarchy, once seen as a stabilizing force, had become a symbol of oppression and stagnation. The growing demand for change was not just about reforming Spain's political system. It was about modernizing the country to keep up with the rest of Europe. Isabella's reign, marked by corruption, stagnation, and failure to reform, became increasingly untenable in a world that was moving toward democracy and progress. As the political situation in Spain became more volatile, Isabella's position became increasingly precarious. Her attempts to placate the military and the public by offering reforms were met with skepticism and disdain. The monarchy, which had once been a source of national pride, had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with Spain. The people had lost faith in their queen, and the forces of change were growing stronger by the day. The growing discontent with Isabella II's rule would ultimately culminate in the Glorious Revolution of 1868. This revolution, led by a coalition of liberals, military leaders, and progressive forces, would result in Isabella's abdication and the end of her reign. But before that moment arrived, the unrest and turmoil of the late 1860s would continue to unfold, marking the final chapters of a reign that had once promised so much but ultimately failed to deliver. By the summer of 1868, the political tensions in Spain had reached a breaking point. The monarchy, under the leadership of Isabella II, had become a symbol of stagnation, corruption, and failure. The country was on the brink of a revolution. The hopes for reform, which had once been embraced by the young queen, had faltered in the face of mounting social and political unrest. The military, long a powerful force within the Spanish political landscape, had become increasingly disillusioned with Isabella's rule. The liberals, too, were frustrated by her inability to bring meaningful reform to the country. The final spark for the revolution came from a coalition of discontented military leaders, politicians, and progressive groups who had long been dissatisfied with Isabella's inability to address the growing problems facing Spain. Among them were General Juan Prim, a prominent military leader, and Francisco Serrano, a seasoned politician. Together, they orchestrated a coup that would shake the foundations of the Spanish monarchy. The revolutionaries, united in their belief that Isabella's reign was beyond saving, began to organize their forces. The call for reform was not only about ending corruption and economic mismanagement, but about creating a new political order in Spain, one that was modern, democratic, and in line with the changes sweeping through Europe. The revolutionaries saw the monarchy as an obstacle to this vision, and they were determined to bring it to an end. On September 18, 1868, the revolutionaries launched their assault on Isabella's rule, leading to what would come to be known as the Glorious Revolution, or La Gloriosa. It began with an uprising in the southern port city of Cadiz, where a fleet of ships under the command of Admiral Tapit rose against the Queen's government. The military forces quickly spread across Spain, rallying around the revolutionary banner. And within days, the revolutionaries had captured key cities and military garrisons. The once loyal Spanish army was now in open revolt. Isabella, who had long been isolated from the realities of her country's political struggles, now faced a rapidly deteriorating situation. She was unprepared for the scope and speed of the revolution. As the rebellion spread, the Queen's government crumbled, and her ministers, many of whom were already deeply involved in the corruption and mismanagement that had plagued her reign, were unable to mount any effective resistance. At the time of the uprising, Isabella was in her summer residence, the royal palace of La Granja, near Segovia. As news of the revolution reached her, she was urged by her advisors to flee the palace and escape to the safety of France. The once great queen, who had ruled Spain for over 3 decades, was now a monarch in flight. Isabella's abdication came swiftly, as she realized that her grip on the throne had slipped beyond repair. By September 30, 1868, Isabella II had been formally deposed, and the monarchy was in turmoil. She fled to France, leaving behind the country she had ruled for so long. Isabella's departure was met with a mixture of relief and celebration across Spain, where many saw her flight as the necessary first step toward change. For the Spanish people, the Glorious Revolution marked the end of an era, but it also opened the door to the possibility of a new future, a future in which the monarchy might be replaced by a more democratic system of government. In the wake of Isabella's abdication, the country was left in a state of flux. The revolutionaries, now in control of much of Spain, were faced with the challenge of determining what would come next. There was no consensus on what form of government Spain should adopt. Some factions called for the establishment of a republic, while others hoped for the restoration of the monarchy with a new, more reform-minded king. The chaos of the revolution was compounded by the absence of a clear successor to Isabella. The issue of who would take the throne became a focal point of debate. In the short term, a provisional government was established, with the goal of stabilizing the country and overseeing the creation of a new constitution. However, the deeper question remained: would Spain return to monarchy? Or would it embrace the ideals of a republic? The political vacuum created by Isabella's departure was quickly filled by the progressive factions of the revolution, who took the opportunity to push for reforms that would shape Spain's future. The influence of military leaders like General Prim and politicians such as Francisco Serrano was significant during this period, and they would be instrumental in determining Spain's future political trajectory. While the revolutionary coalition was united in its desire for change, the specific form that change would take remained uncertain. In the midst of this turmoil, one thing was clear: Isabella II's reign had come to a dramatic and definitive end. Her departure marked the conclusion of an era in Spanish history, and while the country would experience further struggles in the years that followed, the Glorious Revolution of 1868 remains a pivotal moment in the history of modern Spain. Isabella II, once a young queen full of promise, had become a figure of the past, her failure to lead and reform the country ultimately leading to her downfall. For Isabella, The journey into exile was one of profound personal loss. She had spent years trying to maintain control over her kingdom. Yet in the end, it was the forces of change, fueled by disillusionment and frustration, that overtook her. Her reign had been marked by a series of missed opportunities to address the country's deepening political divisions, to reform the economy, and to bridge the growing gap between the monarchy and the people. In the end, Isabella's inability to adapt to the changing political landscape, her reliance on corrupt advisors, and her distance from the everyday struggles of her people led to her downfall. In France, Isabella would live out the remainder of her life in relative obscurity. Though she retained her royal title, she was no longer a queen in power. Her time in exile was marked by personal struggles, as she came to terms with the loss of her crown and the country she had once ruled. Isabella would spend her final years away from the political sphere, a monarch without a throne, a queen without a kingdom. Though Isabella II's reign ended in failure, it was not without its lasting impact on Spanish history. Her deposition marked the end of the Bourbon dynasty's dominance in Spain. And while the monarchy would eventually be restored, it would never regain the absolute power that Isabella had once enjoyed. The Glorious Revolution opened the door to new political possibilities for Spain, including the establishment of a constitutional monarchy and, eventually, the creation of the Spanish Republic in the 20th century. With the fall of Isabella II's reign, Spain was irrevocably altered. The Glorious Revolution of 1868 had swept away a monarch whose rule had spanned over 3 tumultuous decades. And her departure marked a pivotal shift in the history of the Spanish monarchy. While the streets of Spain filled with jubilant crowds celebrating the end of an era, Isabella II found herself in the midst of profound personal loss and uncertainty. No longer a queen, she was now a woman in exile, stripped of the power that had once defined her existence. The day Isabella left Spain was one of great sorrow and anxiety. Fleeing to France with her children, she left behind the country she had once ruled, not knowing what the future held for her. For Isabella, the transition from queen to commoner was as jarring as it was painful. She had spent her entire life preparing for the crown, yet she was now a woman without a throne, without a role in the world she had once known. The wealth, the opulence, the courtly intrigue, all of it was now behind her. In its place was a life of uncertainty, and the once powerful queen now had to confront her own vulnerability. Upon her arrival in France, Isabella II was granted asylum by Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. The French government, having recently undergone its own political changes, welcomed the former queen, but it was clear that her status was no longer that of a ruling monarch. Isabella's exile was not just a personal fall from grace, it was a reflection of the dramatic shifts in European politics. The monarchies that had once ruled over vast empires were now increasingly under threat. And the world Isabella had once known seemed to be slipping away from her. In exile, Isabella lived a life marked by personal and financial struggles. Her former court, once filled with the grandeur and luxury of royal life, was now replaced with the stark reality of life in foreign lands. Isabella was no longer surrounded by the opulent trappings of royalty. She lived modestly, struggling to maintain the dignity and respect that had once been afforded to her as queen. Her children, who had once been heirs to the Spanish throne, were now left without a kingdom to rule. The family, once a symbol of power, now found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Isabella's personal life, already fraught with difficulty during her reign, became even more complicated in exile. Her relationship with her husband, Francisco de Assis, had always been strained, and their marriage had never been a true partnership. Francisco, who had been indifferent to his duties as consort, continued to live separately from Isabella in their later years of exile. His apathy and indifference only added to Isabella's sense of isolation. The emotional distance between them, which had been a feature of their marriage for years, became even more pronounced as they navigated the difficult years of exile together. During her time in France, Isabella attempted to maintain some semblance of her former status. She was often visited by former members of her court, though these visits did little to alleviate the profound sense of loss she felt. Though she was no longer a queen in the traditional sense, Isabella's status as a former monarch continued to hold some measure of influence. She would occasionally meet with foreign dignitaries and political figures, though her role in international affairs was diminished. The Spanish government, meanwhile, had gone through a series of changes after her abdication, and the monarchy had been briefly replaced by a republic, only to see the establishment of a new Bourbon monarch in 1874. In the meantime, Isabella's exile was marked by the ongoing instability of Spain. The political landscape of the country continued to shift, with the monarchy itself experiencing several false starts and upheavals. After the brief experiment with a republic, Spain saw the return of the Bourbon family in 1874. When Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, was declared king, although she had no formal role in the new regime, Isabella's son's ascension to the throne was seen as a symbolic restoration of the monarchy. Yet, for Isabella, the return of the Bourbon monarchy in Spain was bittersweet. She had lost the throne and had been forced into exile. And while her son's reign brought a degree of stability to the country, it did little to erase the pain of her own fall from power. In the years following her exile, Isabella struggled with feelings of deep sadness and regret. The loss of the throne weighed heavily on her, and she frequently reflected on the mistakes and missed opportunities that had defined her reign. Her inability to adapt to the changing political landscape of Spain, combined with her failure to unite the country during its most turbulent years, haunted her. Isabella had long been criticized for her reliance on advisors who had led her astray, and the perception that she had been out of touch with the needs of her people was something she could not escape. However, there were moments in her exile when Isabella found solace in her family. Despite the strained relationships within her household, her children remained an important part of her life. Her son, Alfonso, who would eventually become king, visited her frequently, and the bond between mother and son remained strong. Isabella took pride in his accomplishments and hoped that, in time, he would be able to restore Spain to the glory it had once known under the Bourbon dynasty. Yet, even as she clung to this hope, she could not escape the reality that her own reign had been a failure, one that had led to her eventual downfall and exile. Isabella's health began to decline as she entered her later years. The stress of exile, combined with the emotional toll of losing the crown, had taken its toll on the former queen. She spent her final years in relative obscurity, away from the spotlight that had once defined her life. Isabella's time in exile became a period of reflection, as she came to terms with the end of her reign and the changing world around her. While she continued to live with dignity, she was no longer the powerful figure she had once been. The loss of her kingdom was a wound that would never fully heal. And in her final years, she looked back on her life with a mixture of regret and resignation. In 1883, Isabella II passed away in the Château de Pau in France at the age of 53. Her death marked the end of an era in Spanish history, the final chapter in a reign that had been filled with both hope and disappointment. Her legacy, once a subject of fierce debate, would continue to be shaped by historians and scholars in the years to come. Some would remember Isabella as a queen who had failed to navigate the political turbulence of her time, while others would see her as a victim of circumstance, caught between the forces of change and tradition that had shaped her world. Despite the personal tragedies and political failures of her reign, Isabella II's death marked the end of a tumultuous period in Spain's history. Her son, Alfonso XII, would go on to rule Spain and bring stability to the monarchy. Isabella's passing signaled the end of the dynasty that had begun with her grandfather, Ferdinand VII, and the beginning of a new chapter in Spain's political evolution. Though she had been exiled and rejected by her country, Isabella II remained a part of Spain's history, a figure whose reign was both a lesson in the fragility of power and a testament to the resilience of the Spanish monarchy. Isabella II's death in 1883 marked the final chapter of a reign that had once seemed full of promise but ultimately became synonymous with political instability, corruption, and missed opportunities. As the former queen's body was laid to rest in the Château de Pau, a solemn reflection seemed to envelop her story. While Isabella had been forced into exile, she left behind a complex legacy, one of both failure and resilience. The tale of her life and reign would continue to echo through the annals of Spanish history, a vivid reminder of the precariousness of power and the changing tides of political fortune. When Isabella II ascended the throne as a young girl, The hopes of an entire nation were placed upon her slender shoulders. Spain, torn by internal conflict and political division, needed a figurehead who could unite the country. Initially, it seemed as though Isabella, with her youthful idealism and the promise of reform, could fulfill this role. She represented a bridge between the past and the future, an opportunity to move away from the autocratic rule of her father, Ferdinand VII, and toward a more modern, constitutional monarchy. However, the reality of governing in such a turbulent time proved to be far more challenging than Isabella could have ever imagined. Her reign had been marked by a series of ill-fated decisions. As the queen oscillated between liberal and conservative factions, unable to solidify her own vision for Spain's future, the Carlist Wars, the failed liberal reforms, the corruption in her court, and her inability to reconcile the growing demands of both the people and her advisors all contributed to the eventual downfall of her reign. The monarchy, once a pillar of Spain's strength, was slowly eroded by political factions, military unrest, and social inequality. Yet, as much as Isabella's reign was defined by failure and personal sorrow, there were elements of resilience that marked her life. Throughout her years in exile, she maintained a dignified silence, refusing to engage in the political battles that had forced her from the throne. Her personal struggles, including her deeply unhappy marriage to Francisco de Assis, seemed to only add to the sense of isolation that she felt in the years following her abdication. Despite these personal and political challenges, Isabella II never fully abandoned her belief in the monarchy's potential. Her role as mother to Alfonso XII, who would later restore the Bourbon dynasty to the Spanish throne, gave her a sense of continuity, a hope that her family's legacy could be preserved. Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, would eventually succeed where she had failed, ascending to the throne in 1874 after a period of political turmoil. He worked to stabilize Spain and restore the monarchy's legitimacy. Under his rule, Spain saw the return of a more constitutional form of government, and the monarchy regained some of the influence it had lost during Isabella's reign. Alfonso XII's reign was marked by efforts to modernize Spain, create political stability, and improve the economy, a task that was only made possible by the reforms put in place after the collapse of Isabella's regime. While Isabella's reign ended in disgrace, her legacy was, in some ways, preserved through the success of her son. Alfonso XII would father the next generation of Spanish monarchs, continuing the Bourbon line that had been interrupted by Isabella's abdication. The Bourbon family's return to the throne, after the short-lived experiment with the Spanish Republic, symbolized the eventual restoration of order and tradition to Spain. Isabella's personal legacy, though marred by her failure to reign effectively, was woven into the fabric of Spain's continued monarchy, which would eventually transition into the 20th century. As Isabella's life and reign were examined by historians, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. In some accounts, she was portrayed as a queen trapped by the political forces of her time. Unable to overcome the divisions that consumed Spain, her failure to navigate the complex landscape of Spanish politics, coupled with the personal hardships she faced, painted her reign as one of missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential. Yet, there were others who saw Isabella as a tragic figure, a woman who had tried, perhaps too earnestly, to hold together a kingdom that was fractured beyond repair. The political instability of Isabella's time was not unique to Spain. It reflected the larger shifts occurring across Europe during the 19th century. The rise of constitutional monarchies, the spread of liberal ideas, and the increasing demands for political representation were all part of a wider transformation of European society. Isabella's inability to adapt to these changes, particularly her reliance on conservative factions and her failure to foster broad-based political reforms, led to the erosion of her power. She was caught between competing ideologies, liberalism and conservatism, that defined her era and which, ultimately, proved incompatible with her style of rule. While some might have viewed Isabella's reign as a failure, others took a different approach, recognizing her as a queen who lived through the most trying period in Spanish history. The political battles she fought, the personal sacrifices she made, and the painful collapse of her reign were all part of a larger, more complex narrative about the monarchy in Spain. Isabella had been forced into exile, but her story didn't end there. Her legacy, though fraught with hardship, contributed to the transformation of Spain and to the larger history of the monarchy in Europe. In her later years, Isabella seemed to reflect on the role she had played in history. Her time in exile was marked by periods of deep introspection, as she came to terms with the end of her reign and the new political realities that had emerged in Spain. As she lived out her final days in France, Isabella found solace in the idea that her son, Alfonso XII, would continue the work that she had begun, even if she had not been able to complete it herself. It was a quiet, reflective end to a turbulent life. Isabella II passed away in 1883, far from the country that had once been her kingdom. And yet, even in death, she remained a figure of immense significance. She had been the queen who had weathered the storms of war, political strife, and personal heartbreak. Though her reign ended in exile, Isabella's story continued to resonate as a lesson in the fragility of power, the complexity of leadership, and the enduring struggle for change in the face of overwhelming odds. Her final resting place, away from the land she had ruled, was symbolic of the inescapable truth of her reign, that even the most powerful monarchs are not immune to the forces of history. As the Spanish monarchy moved into the 20th century, and as the political landscape of Europe continued to evolve, Isabella II's legacy remained an essential part of Spain's journey. The glorious revolution that had deposed her ultimately led to the political restoration of the Bourbon dynasty, a dynasty that had faced numerous trials but survived. While Isabella's reign had been marred by failure, the monarchy that she had represented would continue to evolve and adapt, shaped in part by the lessons of her time on the throne. In the end, Isabella II's life was a complex and contradictory one. She had been a monarch, a mother, a wife, and a queen who faced overwhelming challenges. Her reign might have ended in failure, but the story of Isabella II remains a reminder of the tumultuous path of history, where even the most powerful figures must grapple with the forces of change and the ever-present march of time.